Helena's ancestral connection to the lands of Brittany. Previously, the dawn mist guided Alexander, Helena, Makeda, and Amina through a delta that breathed like a living being. And at the heart of that labyrinth of waters, Concarneau was born. Not merely a shelter, but an ancestral covenant between the ocean and memory, sealed by the symbol of the sun entwined with the star. The founding of the first sacred port brought trials of rain, mud, and dilemmas that tested the crew's unity to the very edge of what could be endured. But it also awakened in each of them something that cannot be built, only revealed: the strength of a community willing to take root without surrendering the horizon. When the call of the sea returned, Alexander and Helena understood that to remain is also a form of sailing. And so, beneath the boreal lights and waters that radiated light from within, the Alethea and the oasis of moonlight set sail once more, navigating in circles that were not errors but teachings, until Douarnenez revealed itself. The place where the path recognizes itself and where the spirit of the group was prepared, without anyone yet knowing it, for the encounter that would change everything. In this new episode, we will discover together how, leaving Douarnenez behind, Alexander, Helena, Makeda, and Amina will guide the Alethea through waters that do not obey the common laws of navigation. For the English Channel is not merely a geographical passage, but an invisible threshold between what is known and what cannot yet be named. From the high hills, the sight of the mountain ranges beyond the sea will kindle in Helena a premonition that is not hers alone. It belongs to every woman of her bloodline who gazed upon those peaks before her and who, for reasons history never fully recorded, could not follow. The crossing, marked by winds that shift their intention and silences denser than any storm, will prepare the spirit of the group for a destination that does not reveal itself at once, because the destinations that truly matter never reveal themselves at once. In Amesbury, in Brittany, the entire journey will change its meaning when Helena discovers that the ground beneath her feet holds a root of blood she never knew she carried. Edith, sister of her mother Tiphys and cousin of her father Lysimachus, will emerge from the shadows of the forest as the answer to a question Helena never knew she was asking. What follows is not merely celebration. It is the closing of a circle that began before any of those present were born, and that only now, in this very moment, holds the conditions to be completed. The farewell to Douarnenez and the call of the mountain ranges. There was something in the mountains that should not have been visible at that distance, and yet Helena could see them. The dawn rose over Douarnenez with that particular quality of light that does not illuminate. It reveals. The dunes that had sheltered the group's days of rest glowed in amber, as though the sand itself had absorbed everything that had taken place there and was now returning it in the form of radiance. Alexander walked along the beach with slow, deliberate steps, leaving marks that the sea would soon erase with the indifference of forces that keep no human record. Each footprint seemed a question. Is it possible to leave a place that has already left us? Helena walked at his side, feeling her heart waver between anticipated longing and that other feeling. The one that has no name, no apparent origin, yet pulses with the regularity of a second heartbeat. A feeling she had known her entire life, but that on that morning, for the first time, pointed in a specific direction. And to you who follow this crossing, who feel the wind of these ancient stories touch your soul as though they were your own, I leave a simple but essential request. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share in the comments what this moment stirs in you. Every gesture of yours is like a flame lit upon this fire that unites hearts across time and space. In doing so, you do not merely strengthen this journey, you make it possible. Because, like the sailors of the Alethea, you too are blowing with us upon the sails of destiny. The story continues, but it is your presence that keeps the fire burning and the sea awake. The Alethea and the oasis of moonlight rested at anchor in the cove, with that stillness belonging to things that already know what comes next and wait only for human beings to realize it. The crew worked in silence, the kind of silence that is not the absence of conversation, but the presence of something more important than anything words could contain. Ropes adjusted, masts checked, provisions organized with the precision of those who have learned that the sea does not forgive those who depart unprepared. Makeda observed everything with eyes that had changed since Concarneau. No longer the eyes of a princess discovering the world for the first time, but those of someone who had begun to understand that discovering the world is, in truth, a way of discovering oneself. Amina moved among the men with that serenity that is not the absence of awareness of danger, but an abundance of trust in purpose. From the heights of the hills that embraced Douarnenez, Helena stopped, not because she chose to. She stopped because her feet simply refused to go on. And it was there, in that involuntary stillness, that she saw the mountains, distant, wrapped in mists that were not the mists of dawn. For that haze would not dissipate with the sun, as it was made not of moisture, but of time. A mountain range rose beyond the sea, with the precision of something that had been placed exactly there to be found by exactly her. The mountains did not shine. They did something different. They pulsed, with an invisible frequency that Helena perceived not through her eyes, but through her blood. A shiver traveled the length of her spine with the slowness of things that do not wish to be ignored. It was not fear, it was recognition. The sensation of being called by name in a language that precedes words. The language of blood, of ancestral memory, of a destiny woven before birth itself. Alexander climbed the hill and found Helena there, motionless as one of the ancient stones of Douarnenez, yet vibrating with something that stones do not possess. He followed her gaze without asking what she was looking at, because he already knew. He felt it too. "Do you feel what I feel?" she asked, without turning her eyes from those mountains that were at once distant and utterly present. "Yes," he answered, with the kind of honesty that is only possible between people who have stopped trying to protect each other from certain truths. It is as though those mountains hold something that belongs to us, something we do not yet know how to name. Helena nodded with a slowness that was thought in motion. "They are not merely stone, Alexander. They are portals, and on the other side, something, or someone, is waiting for us." He took her hand. Neither of them needed to say another word. What existed between them in that instant was more complete than any sentence could be. When the sun reached its highest point, that hour when shadows disappear and the world becomes, for a moment, without depth, without hiding places, completely exposed, the vessels began to move. The sails opening sounded like the wings of something that belongs neither entirely to the world of birds nor to the world of men, something between the two, existing only in the instant of departure. The Alethea glided across the water with the elegance of one who knows the secret rhythm of the sea, and the oasis of moonlight followed faithfully, like a fulfilled promise that requires no witnesses. From the beach, those who remained waved not with sorrow, but with gratitude, for gratitude is the emotion of those who understand what they have received, and Douarnenez had understood. As the village diminished on the horizon, Helena did not turn her face away. She simply kept watching until there was nothing left to see, and then, only then, she turned toward the distant mountains. The call had not diminished with distance, it had grown. The crossing of the English Channel and the shifting winds. The English Channel was not what the map suggested. It was something else entirely. The sea opened before the vessels like a scroll upon which history was still being written, vast and filled with possibilities that could be promises or traps depending on who encountered them and with what degree of readiness. The Alethea cut through the waters with steadiness, and Alexander held the helm with hands that knew their work, but his eyes never ceased searching the horizon with that quality of attention that is not a captain's vigilance, but the expectation of someone awaiting confirmation of something already felt as truth. Helena, seated at the prow, let the wind work through her hair with the passivity of one who has learned that certain forces need space to do what they came to do. She felt that every league sailed was not merely distance covered, but another layer of understanding removed, as though the sea were, with each wave, stripping away something she no longer needed to carry. A channel revealed itself not as a passage, but as a living test. The waters, at times calm with the specific intention of creating false security, at times turbulent with the brutality of things that want to know what you are made of, seemed to carry a purpose that surpassed the physics of currents and wind. Cross-currents arose from nowhere, not from geographical nowhere, but from that other nowhere, deeper, where things exist before taking visible form. The wind blew in unpredictable gusts, now from the north, now from the south, as though the very air were deliberating, weighing the intentions of the sailors before deciding whether to help or challenge them. Makeda, observing the behavior of the sea with eyes that had learned to read the invisible, murmured to Amina, "It is as though the ocean is asking questions." The guardian answered without hesitation, "And every response we give with the helm is also a choice of the soul." For 3 days, the crossing demanded a vigilance that was not merely physical. The nights were dense with low clouds that concealed the stars, as though the sky were deliberately removing every point of reference, forcing the sailors to find others within themselves. Alexander navigated by instinct and by the subtle reading of currents, the kind of reading that is learned in no school but develops over years of surrender to the sea. Helena remained at his side through the night watches with a presence that was, for him, more guiding than any star. "There is something beyond these waters," she said one night before dawn, as the fog settled over the deck with the specific consistency of things that exist between the visible and the invisible. "It is not danger, it is presence, as though we are being watched by eyes that do not belong to this time." Alexander did not doubt her. He felt it too, and felt that she had named with precision what he had not yet been able to formulate. The crew, seasoned by storms on the open ocean, began to show a different kind of unease. Not the unease of physical threat, but that other kind, harder to name and therefore harder to overcome. The unease of the inexplicable. The silence of the sea was unsettling not for the absence of sound, but for the quality of what was present within it. A dense and deliberate waiting, the waiting of one who holds a secret and expects the other person to ask the right question. Some men murmured ancient prayers with the urgency of those who understand that formal protection is the only distance they can maintain between themselves and the incomprehensible. Makeda showed no fear. She showed something more interesting and more courageous. Curiosity. A curiosity that did not retreat before what it could not understand, but advanced with the humility of one who knows that comprehension comes after experience, never before. "Thule is closer," she would say, and the phrase was not hope, it was a diagnosis. On the 4th day, the wind changed with the abruptness of something that had made up its mind. A sharp breeze from the north carried with it the scent of pine trees and wet earth, signals that arrived not through navigational instruments, but through the body, the sense of smell, the skin, that sixth sense sailors develop after years given over to the sea. The Alethea gained speed, and Helena rose to her feet with a heart in a state she could not have classified as joy or terror. Perhaps because the difference between the two, at certain fundamental moments, is merely a question of how much we are willing to receive what comes. The mountain ranges, once distant and hazy, like promises uncertain of themselves, were beginning to reveal themselves with a clarity that was not only visible, it was felt, as though the mountains were not becoming visible because the mist had lifted, but because the group had finally become capable of seeing them. When the coastline appeared on the horizon, The murmur that passed through the crew was not merely relief. It was that kind of recognition that human beings rarely experience in conscious life, yet which the body stores from before any memory. That land, with its high cliffs and its vegetation that seemed green in a more intense way than any green the sailors had ever seen, felt familiar even to those who had never set foot in that hemisphere. Alexander and Helena exchanged a glance. One of those glances that contains an entire conversation, made of questions and answers that neither could have articulated in words, yet which both understood with the completeness of things that are felt before they are thought. The sea had fulfilled its role, not as guardian, nor as master, as initiator. And now the land was calling them toward the next stage of a transformation that none of the five aboard yet fully understood had begun long before any of them had made the decision to depart. The arrival in Brittany and the ancestral premonition. Helena's feet touched the sand, and the sand responded. The Breton coast rose before them with that quality belonging to presences that require no movement to demonstrate power. Cliffs of gray stone crowned by dense forests that descended to the sea with the deliberateness of things that had arrived there first, and, for that very reason, felt no need to yield passage to anyone. The sound of waves breaking against the rocks echoed with a rhythm that was not random. It carried the periodicity of something intentional, like drums receiving pilgrims with the specific protocol reserved for those who have been awaited long enough for the waiting itself to become ritual. Alexander guided the Alethea into a sheltered cove with the skill of one who knows his work, and with the caution of one who understands that certain arrivals are irreversible. The oasis of moonlight followed, and when the anchors plunged into the water, the sound they made was not merely mechanical, it was conclusive. The first to disembark were Alexander and Helena, followed by Makeda and Amina, in an order that had never been agreed upon, but that, as it unfolded, seemed to have been the only possible order. When Helena's feet touched the wet sand of that shore, something happened that she had not expected and for which there could be no preparation. Her entire body recognized it, not her mind, which was still processing the arrival with all its logical machinery. Her body, the skin, the bones, the blood circulating through her veins at the temperature she had inherited from women who had walked that same ground before her. A tremor passed through her from the soles of her feet to the nape of her neck, not from cold, but from that specific quality of vibration that rises when something sleeping within us is awakened by contact with its counterpart in the outer world. Alexander perceived Helena's emotion in the way she stood motionless and took her hand with the silent gesture of those who have learned that certain forms of comfort do not use words. "Do you feel that you have been here before?" he asked. She nodded, unable to speak, for speech requires choosing among possibilities, and what she felt in that moment had no alternatives. It was simply truth. Makeda walked along the beach with that peculiar mixture of wonder and belonging that develops in people who have grown up in contact with the sacred and who, for that very reason, recognize holiness when they encounter it without needing a sign to point the way. The moss-covered stones, the streams descending from the hills with the specific musicality of waters that are in no hurry, the birds with plumage she had never seen yet that seemed to know her. Everything in that place possessed a quality of wholeness, as though the entire landscape had been composed with the purpose of being exactly what it was, without excess or lack. Amina surveyed the surroundings with an attentiveness that never becomes paranoia, but never fully relaxes either, and within her, with growing clarity, a deepening serenity was taking shape, one that emerges only when a place confirms what instinct had all. The crew came ashore gradually, transforming the beach into a space that was simultaneously an arrival and a preparation for what was to come. The camp was set up near the bank of a crystal-clear stream with the efficient organization that develops in groups who have already learned to work together under pressure. Fires were lit, and the scent of bread and barley began to spread through the air with the generosity of simple things that are, in truth, the most essential. Helena helped with the tasks through the mechanical gestures of one who is present in the body but absent in another dimension, because within her, something pulsed with the insistence of a call that could not be deferred by provisions or campsites. "I need to walk," she said to Alexander, in that voice that is not a request for permission, but a communication of necessity. He understood without question. He had learned, over the course of the journey, that the moments when Helena felt this compulsion to walk were precisely the moments when something important was about to happen. The four of them, Alexander, Helena, Makeda, and Amina, entered the forest along a path that appeared to have been traced not by human hands, but by the patient accumulation of footsteps across generations of people who had passed through that same place with the same purpose that none of them could fully name. The trees formed a green canopy that filtered the sunlight into beams that did not seem random, each one falling in exactly the place where it was needed, illuminating exactly what needed to be seen. The ground was covered in moss that muffled the sound of their footsteps with such thoroughness that the group moved in silence, not merely because they had decided to be quiet, but because the environment itself had absorbed the very possibility of noise. Helena walked ahead, guided by an instinct she did not rationally understand, but trusted with a completeness that was, in itself, a transformation. For she had reached that point of the journey where trust and understanding were no longer the same thing, and where trust had revealed itself as the shortest path between ignorance and destiny. After a span of time that could have been an hour or an eternity, and the difference between the two, they discovered, depended only on how much presence you brought to the path. They arrived at a clearing where the sunlight poured down in cascades with the specific lavishness of moments that deserved to be fully illuminated. At its center stood a perfect circle of ancient stones, not ancient as in old, but ancient as in eternal, as though they had arrived there before time itself and had decided to wait. A spring rose from the earth at the center of the circle, feeding a small lake that reflected the sky with a fidelity no human mirror can ever equal. Helena approached with steps that slowed progressively, as though each meter separating her from the spring was also a meter separating her from a truth that, once touched, could never again be unknown. When her fingers met the surface of the water, the vision arrived with the precision of things that do not ask permission. A fair-haired woman resembling her, kneeling in that same spot, offering prayers in a voice Helena could not hear, but felt vibrating in her very bones. And beside the woman, a child, Helena as a child, watching with eyes full of wonder, a scene that was not yet happening, yet was, in some way, already happening. The vision vanished, but the certainty it left behind did not vanish. It never would. Her mother, Tiphys, had stood in that exact place, and that spring held the beginning of a story that Helena was only now discovering was also her own. The revelation of blood and the encounter with Edith. The voice came from the forest before there was any sign of human presence, and it was a voice Helena recognized without ever having heard it before. Helena remained kneeling at the edge of the spring, her heart beating at a rhythm that was not hers alone. It was the rhythm of every woman in her bloodline who had knelt before sacred water with the same weight of unanswered questions pressing against the chest. Alexander, Makeda, and Amina watched in silence with the respect of those who understand that there are moments that do not permit intervention, only witness. The air vibrated with that subtle and unmistakable energy that Helena had learned to recognize over the course of the journey. The energy of the instant immediately before a revelation, when the universe pauses to ensure that everyone present is sufficiently attentive to receive what is coming. And then a sound broke the silence, not an intrusion, but a completion. branches creaking with the calculated precision of footsteps that know where they are falling, and then, emerging from that sonic preparation, a woman's voice, clear and steady, that came from no specific direction, but from all of them at once. Whoever comes to the fountain of remembrance must be prepared to find what they have forgotten. Helena rose immediately, her body taut with that tension that is not fear, but recognition on the verge of completing itself. The voice felt familiar to her with the familiarity of things that were known before any conscious memory. From the shadows between the trees, a woman emerged, and the way she emerged was that of something not presenting itself for the first time, but reappearing after an absence too long to be considered a simple absence. She was tall, with an elegance of bearing that had not been learned but inherited, her silver hair catching the sunlight with the brightness, not the silver of metals, but the silver of things that have carried great heat for a long time and now radiated as light. Her face bore the marks of time, with the honesty of people who have never tried to erase them, because they understood that each line is evidence of something that was truly lived, not merely endured. Her eyes, gray like Helena's, gray with that same specific shade that is not the absence of color, but all colors fused, shone with a vitality that entirely belied the silver of her hair. She wore a linen tunic bearing embroidered symbols that Helena recognized before she recognized the woman. They were the same symbols Tiphys, her mother, used to weave into winter cloaks with a concentration that Helena, as a child, had never fully understood, but that now, in this instant, in this place, she was beginning to understand. The woman stopped a few paces away, studying Helena with that particular expression that exists only when we recognize in someone the presence of one we have already loved and lost. "You have her eyes," she said, her voice trembling not with weakness, but with an emotion that exceeds the capacity for containment. "You have the eyes of Tiphys." Helena felt the ground disappear beneath her feet, not metaphorically, but as a physical sensation, as though gravity had decided to suspend its rules for a moment. How did you know my mother?" The woman smiled, and tears began to fall down her face with the serenity of things that have been held back too long to remain contained indefinitely. "Because I am her sister. My name is Edith." Time seemed to freeze, not in the dramatic way of stories, but in the real way, the one in which consciousness suddenly outpaces the speed of events and perceives them in slow motion, absorbing every detail with an intensity that the normal velocity of the world would never permit. Helena tried to process the words. Sister of Tiphys, Helena's aunt, a woman who had existed her entire life, unknown on the other side of a sea that Helena had crossed not because of her, or perhaps, she now discovered, precisely because of her. Alexander stepped forward and placed his hand on Helena's shoulder with the specific steadiness of presences that do not seek to prevent emotion from happening, only to ensure that it happens safely. Makeda and Amina exchanged glances of astonishment, not the superficial kind, but the kind that rises when one witnesses something that confirms what has always been suspected about the non-accidental nature of the universe. Edith stepped forward, extending her hands with the openness of one who offers not a handshake, but an embrace deferred by decades. When Tiphys departed with Lysimachus toward the south, I remained here, guarding the roots of our lineage. We promised that one day, if the gods permitted, our paths would cross again. Her voice broke, but she completed the sentence because certain phrases must be spoken to the end regardless of the cost. Tiphys never returned, and now you return in her place, Helena, carrying her spirit alive within your chest. Helena could not hold back her tears, nor did she try, for she had reached a point in the journey where restraint was no longer a virtue, but an obstacle. She moved toward Edith, and the two embraced with that quality of embrace that transcends physical contact and becomes something closer to a temporary fusion of histories, because there, it was not simply two women meeting, but two generations, two banks of the same river, two halves of a promise that had waited decades to be fulfilled. It was as though, in that embrace, Helena were also embracing Tiphys, and all the women of her lineage who had come before Tiphys, and all who would come after Helena, and the entire circle, with all its circumference impossible to contain within two pairs of human arms. "She spoke of you," said Helena, her voice thick with the emotion that makes vowels unsteady. "On cold nights, when she told me stories of Thule, she spoke of a sister who had stayed behind to guard the land while she guarded the sea." Edith stroked Helena's hair with the gesture of one who recognizes the texture of something that has been described many times but is being encountered for the first time. "And I kept my promise. I have guarded this land, waiting for the day when someone of our lineage would return, and here you are, bringing with you the wind of the south and the spirit of the north." Alexander observed the scene with that specific warmth that rises in the chest when we witness the healing of a wound that existed before us and would continue after us, but that in this moment, this single moment, has been closed. He knew that encounter was not coincidence with the same certainty with which he knew the direction of the wind, not through evidence, but through the accumulated understanding of how things work when you pay close enough attention for long enough. Makeda, moved with that specific emotion of one who recognizes in another story their own story seen from a different angle, moved close to Helena and took her hand. "Do you see, Helena? The sea did not bring us only to unknown lands. It brought us to the home you never knew you had." Amina, always wise with the wisdom that does not like to make noise, but that, when it speaks, says something that endures. The ways of the gods are circular. What appears to be a departure is always, at its core, a return. Edith looked at the entire group, at those four people whom destiny had woven together with threads of different materials, and who, even so, formed a fabric more resilient than any of them could have formed alone, and said, with a voice that was at once decree and invitation, "You come not as strangers, but as children returning home. This land is yours as much as it is mine. Today we will celebrate not only the meeting, we will celebrate the continuity of a lineage that never broke, even when all who formed it believed it was irremediably shattered." With those words, and there was in Edith's words the specific weight of phrases composed over many years of waiting, and that, for that reason, arrive complete, with nothing left over and nothing missing. She led the group through the forest along a path that only she knew, with the intimacy of one who has walked it so many times that it has become an extension of herself. As they walked, she spoke of Tiphys with the affectionate precision of one who keeps memories with the same care with which fragile objects are kept, every detail preserved, every nuance honored. She spoke of Lysimachus and of the nature of the love that had united them, a love that did not need to be forbidden in order to be extraordinary, but that was forbidden as well, which added to it the specific dimension of things chosen with full knowledge of the cost. "Your mother left seeking the south," said Edith, looking at Helena as she walked with that capacity some people have of maintaining conversation and path without one interfering with the other. "But her heart never left the north. And now you return, completing the circle she began." Helena received every word with reverence, not the reverence of those who respect authority, but of those who recognize that they are receiving something that was kept specifically for them. The sun was beginning to descend, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that the forest received with the generosity of things that know how to let the light in, and the village, waiting beyond the trees, waited with the specific patience of things that have waited so long that patience has ceased to be an effort and has become a nature. Amesbury, the ancient village and the celebration of reunion. There was something in Amesbury that no map could capture because it was not geographical. The village revealed itself to the eyes of the travelers with that quality belonging to things that do not display themselves, but present themselves, a subtle and fundamental distinction. Houses of stone and wood were scattered across the landscape with the harmony not of planned symmetry, but of the organic coexistence of things that have grown together long enough to learn how to share space without competing for it. The thatched rooftops glowed golden in the evening light, as though they had absorbed the sun of enough generations to keep it stored within. The scent that reached them was composite: bread, aromatic herbs, damp earth, something floral that Helena could not identify with her mind, but that her body identified readily, because the body, unlike the mind, does not depend on names to recognize what belongs to it. At the center of the village, a fire burned with the constancy of something maintained not by human hands, but by collective intention, the beating heart of a community that had learned that certain flames must be kept alive even when no one fully understands why. When Edith and the group appeared at the entrance, the work ceased, not abruptly, the way it does when there is threat, but with the gentle gradualness of things that pause to honor what has arrived. Edith raised her hand in greeting, not the ceremonial gesture of those who perform rituals, but the weighted gesture of those who know what the gesture means and choose to make it by the force of that meaning. Her voice rang across the square with that quality of voice certain leaders possess, not the voice of authority, but of truth. And the difference between the two is that the first demands obedience, while the second inspires attention. My brothers and sisters of Amesbury, I bring you those whom the gods promised would come. This is Helena, daughter of Tiphys, my sister who departed many years ago in search of the sea, and with her come her companions, Alexander, navigator of endless waters, Makeda, princess of the lands of the sun, and Amina, guardian of a wisdom that the ages cannot erase. They have crossed seas and storms, passed through portals and circles to reach us. And today we seal once again the covenant between North and South, between land and ocean, between the lineage that remained and the lineage that departed and that now returns. The murmur of approval that followed was not polite. It was authentic, that specific frequency of human voices when something resonates with what they already knew but had not yet been spoken aloud. The inhabitants of Amesbury did not receive the travelers as guests. They received them as parts of themselves that had been absent too long. Women approached Helena, touching her hair and her hands with the naturalness of those who recognize the texture of their own lineage in another's body, murmuring blessings in a language that Helena did not entirely understand with her mind, but that her blood decoded with surprising precision. Children surrounded Makeda with the fearless curiosity of childhood, which does not separate wonder from welcome. And the princess received that attention with the genuine joy of one who has never lost the capacity to be seen from the outside through her own eyes from within. Amina received respectful greetings from the elders with the reciprocity of one who recognizes peers, wisdom recognizing wisdom across the time and space that separated them. Alexander was led to the central fire, where a cup of warm mead was placed in his hands, not as protocol, but as recognition. He accepted it with the reverence of one who understands that every gesture there was not protocol, but ritual, the conscious and intentional repetition of actions that bind the present to every previous time the same gesture was made with the same purpose. Edith led the group to her home, a spacious construction of stone and wood situated at the edge of the square, with windows that opened onto the cultivated fields and the distant mountains, with the specific arrangement of something built not merely to shelter, but to keep its residents in permanent visual contact with what awaited beyond. The interior was welcoming with that quality of welcome that is not decorative, but accumulated. Decades of lives lived with attention, of stories told around tables that now carried those stories in every mark and every scratch in the wood. Beeswax candles poured golden light over surfaces that had been absorbing golden light for generations. The tapestries on the walls were not ornamental, they were records. And Helena, moving her eyes across them, recognized symbol after symbol, the same ones Tiphys used to embroider. the same ones that appeared in the dreams that Helena had always considered merely dreams, and that, she now understood, had never been merely that. "This house," said Edith, with the voice of one making a statement that is at once a revelation and a restitution, "was built by our grandparents and before them by those who came from Thule when ice still covered the world. You are home, Helena. You always were. You simply did not yet know it." The celebration began at dusk, with the inevitable naturalness of things that need to happen and that, when conditions arrive, happen without additional effort. The central square filled with life, with that specific abundance of communities that celebrate not by occasion, but by nature, that have kept the capacity for festivity alive precisely because they understood that it is not a luxury, but a spiritual necessity. Fires were lit, tables assembled, musical instruments tuned with that careful attention that precedes music, not because technical perfection is the goal, but because the act of tuning is itself a form of preparation of the soul. The aroma of roasted meat, braided breads, and wine warmed with spices filled the air with the specific generosity of scents that do not ask to be noticed, they simply enter. Helena, seated beside Edith with her heart in a state that did not fit entirely within any emotional category she knew, watched Alexander being questioned by the men of the village about his voyages and answering with those stories that, over the course of the journey, had been transformed from accounts of events into something closer to parables, because sufficiently intense experiences, told enough times, always become parables. Makeda danced with the children around the fire with the joy that is only possible when one realizes they are exactly where they should be. Amina conversed with the elder women with the concentration of one who knows they are receiving something that cannot be repeated, because the wisdom of elders is always, to some degree, the wisdom of the unrepeatable. When the moon rose, full and luminous, as though it had calculated its appearance to coincide precisely with that moment, Edith stood and called for silence. And the silence came with the specific swiftness that comes only in communities where silence is also a form of language. "Tonight," she said, her voice steady with that steadiness that does not exclude emotion, but contains it so that it does not dissolve the clarity of what must be said. "We celebrate not merely the arrival of travelers, we celebrate the return of the lineage, the fulfillment of ancient promises, and the renewal of bonds that neither time nor sea could sever. Helena, daughter of Tiphys, you are the bridge between worlds, and with your arrival, Amesbury blooms again." The village broke into applause with the spontaneity that is only possible when collective emotion surpasses the need for coordination. Helena, unable to hold back her tears and unable to regret it, embraced Edith with the strength of one who embraces not merely a person, but the entire meaning of having arrived. That night, beneath the light of the moon that looked on with the benevolent indifference of one who has already witnessed many stories reach their conclusion, the separation of generations was healed with the slow irreversibility of true healings. And the circle, begun by Tiphys at a dawn that none of those present had lived, yet that all of them carried in some deeper layer of memory, was, at last, completed. The night of stories and the secrets revealed. There was a cloak on Helena's shoulders that was not merely fabric, and she had known this from the instant Edith placed it upon her. The night advanced gently over Amesbury with that quality of nights that do not press the day to end, but accompany it through its gradual farewell. The fires crackled with the specific intensity of flames that warm not only the body, but something more interior and more difficult to name. Warmed wine circulated in ceramic pitchers with the heat of shared things, and there is a fundamental difference between receiving something and participating in a sharing, which is the difference between being a guest and being a part. The braided breads, golden and fragrant with herbs and honey, were passed around in a gesture of communion that required no sacred text to be sacred. The intentions with which the gestures were made were sufficient, and here those intentions were visible in every outstretched hand. Helena sat beside Edith, wrapped in the woolen cloak her aunt had placed over her shoulders. An ancient cloak, woven by Tiphys's own hands before her departure, that still carried the distant perfume of her mother, lavender and sea, that specific combination that Helena had always associated with a comfort she did not know the source of, and that now she knew. In touching it, she felt embraced not only by Edith, but by all the women of her lineage who had come before, because certain objects keep affection with the same faithfulness with which the earth keeps seeds. Edith began to tell the stories with that quality of a storyteller who narrates not to inform, but to transmit. For there is an essential difference between the two, the same difference as between teaching facts and teaching how to think. Her voice, steady and melodious, created in the air that specific texture that only the finest stories create. The sensation that what is being narrated is not the past, but the present of another time zone. She spoke of Tiphys and Lysimachus with the detail of one who was a witness and the precision of one who kept every detail as though knowing that one day she would have to return it to someone who would need it. Lysimachus was a distant cousin of our lineage, said Edith, and when he and Tiphys fell in love, they knew they would have to leave. The ancient laws forbade unions within the clan, not out of cruelty, but from an ancestral understanding about bloodlines that had become, over time, more rigid than the wisdom that had originally given rise to it. Helena received every word with that quality of attention that emerges when one is receiving information about one's own origins, not curiosity, but necessity. She had never known the details of that story. Tiphys had spoken of the past with a longing that had always seemed complete in itself, leaving no room for additional questions. Now the questions arrived all at once, and the answers arrived with them. Before she left, Edith continued, and her voice caught slightly, not from weakness, but from that specific emotion that surfaces when one descends to the most important point of a story carried too long. Tiphys made me swear that I would guard the land and keep alive the memory of our lineage. She told me that one day, if the gods permitted, someone of the family would return. And I swore. A pause. I raised my children here, taught them the ancient stories, and now my grandchildren grow beneath the same stars that watched our ancestors come into the world. I never doubted the promise, because Tiphys had never made a promise she was not certain she could keep, even if it were not she herself who kept it. Her voice steadied. And now, seeing you before me, Helena, I know that she kept her part. She sent you back, carrying the spirit of the sea and the courage of the south. The words reached Helena with that depth of revelations that are not absolute novelties, but confirmations of something the body already knew and that the mind was, at last, permitting itself to accept. Alexander, seated near the fire with the mead in his hands that he had not drunk because he was too absorbed to remember he was holding it, listened with the attention of one who recognizes in another's story elements of their own, because the story of Tiphys and Lysimachus, with all its Breton and Mediterranean particularity, was also, at its fundamental core, the story of two human beings who chose the truth of what they felt over the comfort of what was expected of them. He looked at Helena and saw in her eyes the reflection of flames and tears with that simultaneity that is the mark of moments of genuine transformation. When emotion and illumination arrive at the same time, each amplifying the other. He moved closer, took her hand in a silent gesture of support that was also, silently, a declaration. Edith perceived the gesture with the eyes of one who has spent decades learning to see what people do and not merely what they say. I see that the love of Tiphys repeats itself in you, Helena, she said, with the voice of one making a scientific observation about something that exceeds science. Alexander is to you what Lysimachus was to your mother, a companion of the soul, a navigator of destinies running parallel to your own. Alexander inclined his head in respect with the specific humility of one who understands they have received a blessing they did not ask for, but that they recognize as necessary. Makeda, moved with an emotion that was not borrowed but genuinely provoked by stories that resonate with one's own, approached Helena and Edith with steps that carried the quality of one who asks permission without using words. "This story," she said, with the voice of one making a discovery and formulating it aloud at the same moment, "is not only that of one family. It belongs to all of us. I too departed from my land, leaving my father and everything that was certain and safe, seeking something I barely knew how to name. And now I understand that what we seek is not only in Thule, it is in every encounter, in every bond that renews itself, in every moment when we recognize in others what is most essential in ourselves." Amina nodded with the kind of agreement that is not merely ceremonial, but carries the weight of years of observation arriving at the same place by different paths. The gods weave circular destinies. What seems entirely new is always, in some deeper layer, a return disguised as an arrival. Edith raised her cup with the solemnity of those who understand that certain moments deserve to be marked with a visible gesture, not merely felt inwardly. To those who depart and those who remain, to those who sail and those who stand watch, may the paths always cross, and may the bonds, even when stretched to their limit by distance and time, never break. All raised their cups, and the toast was sealed with songs that had outlasted more history than anyone present could have imagined. When the moon reached its highest point, that position in the sky that seems a deliberate pause, as though the moon itself required a moment of contemplation before continuing, Edith led Helena to an ancient stone that rested in a corner of the square with the specific presence of objects that carry more history than their appearance suggests. It was covered in moss and in inscriptions worn by time with that quality of ancient markings, worn not by neglect, but by use, by the touch of many hands across many generations that had laid upon that surface the weight of many promises. "Here," said Edith, "Typhus said farewell to me." She touched this stone and swore that even from far away our blood would remain united, that what the sea separated, blood would hold together. Helena knelt before the stone with that slowness that is respect in motion. She touched it with both hands. She felt the coldness of the rock, and also, undeniably, something more, a presence that was not physical warmth, but that the body recognized as warmth, as though Typhus were there, silently witnessing the return of the daughter she had sent back, not with instructions, but with instinct. Tears fell upon the stone, dampening the moss, and in that instant, that specific instant that could not have happened in any other place or time, Helena understood that Thule was not on the distant horizon they had been pursuing with ships and maps and will. Thule was here, in that encounter, in that love that had crossed generations without extinguishing itself, only waiting for the right moment to be recognized by the one who carried the right blood to recognize it. The renewed bonds and the awakening of the village. The small hours of Amesbury had a texture that existed in no other place Helena had slept or tried to sleep. The sacred silence that lay over the village was made of layers, the silence of fires reduced to embers, the silence of families who had returned to their homes carrying something more than they had brought to the celebration, the silence of the trees around the square that held the echo of the songs with the specific faithfulness of things that listen without needing to reply. Helena remained awake on the steps of Edith's house, watching the sky with the eyes of one who is not trying to see stars, but conversing with them. Alexander appeared quietly, for he had learned, over the course of the journey, that certain states of Helena's did not need to be interrupted, only accompanied. "Could you not sleep?" he asked in that evening voice, the one used when one wishes to make one's presence felt without demanding a response. Helena smiled with that smile that happens more in the eyes than in the mouth. How could I? My heart is overflowing in a way that no horizontal position can accommodate. He sat beside her, took her hand, and the two of them watched the sky with the specific ease of those who need not do anything to be completely present with each other. When the sun finally rose over the hills with the gradual determination of things that do not press but persist, the village began to wake with that quality of dawns that feel like a new beginning, even for those not especially in search of one. The scent of fresh bread in stone ovens mingled with the birdsong of Brittany, birds that sang differently from the birds of the Mediterranean and the birds of the African desert that Makeda knew, sharper, more urgent, as though the birds of the north had learned that summer is brief and that it is necessary to say as much as possible while there is enough light to say it. The streets filled with movement with the naturalness of daily life that is, in certain communities, as laden with meaning as any formal ritual, because every gesture repeated with sufficient attention becomes in time sacred. Helena observed all of this with that specific enchantment of one who is seeing for the first time something they always knew existed, but had lost certainty of finding. She felt that she belonged to that place, not in a way that denied all the other places where she had belonged before, but in a way that completed them. Edith appeared in the doorway with the punctuality of people who rise early, not because they cannot sleep, but because they understand that dawn is the most honest hour of the day, when decisions made have a greater chance of being true than those made at night under the influence of fire and wine. She carried with her a tray bearing warm breads, fresh cheese, and golden honey, not as an offering of hospitality, but as an extension of a welcome that had begun in the forest and had no intention of ending soon. Helena accepted the bread with gratitude of two layers, the immediate gratitude of hunger satisfied and that other, deeper kind, the gratitude of one who realizes they are being cared for by someone who knows precisely the kind of care they need. Alexander watched the interaction between Helena and Edith with the silent, specific joy of one who witnesses something that was destined to happen and that needed only sufficient time and sufficient miles of ocean to find its moment. He knew that reunion benefited not only Helena, it benefited the entire journey, which gained additional meaning each time it revealed that destiny is not a straight line, but a spiral that always returns to its point of origin, now transformed. Makeda and Amina joined the group with that specific energy of people who have slept beneath unfamiliar stars and woken with the feeling that the stars were, after all, less unfamiliar than they had seemed. "The village is magical," said Makeda, with eyes that had developed over the course of the journey, the capacity to recognize magic not as an exception to the world, but as an intrinsic quality of things when looked at with sufficient attention. Every house, every stone, every tree seems to tell a story, and all the stories are different parts of the same larger story. Amina agreed with the kind of agreement that adds rather than merely confirms. And the people receive us not as strangers. They receive us as missing parts that, upon being found, complete something everyone had already felt was incomplete, but that no one had known how to name. Edith smiled with that specific pride of those who have kept something precious and who, upon seeing it recognized by others, feel the validation of decades of care. Amesbury is not merely a village, it is living memory. Here we keep what the rest of the world has been forgetting. And you, in arriving, do not merely receive that past, you renew it with what you have lived, with the journeys you have made, with the alliances you have built. You make it alive in a way that I alone never could. After breakfast, Edith led the group through the village with the naturalness of one performing an introduction, rehearsed not deliberately, but through the accumulation of years lived in that space. Every encounter was a celebration with the specificity of genuine celebrations, embraces that had weight, blessings that had history, gifts that had memory. An elder with a long white beard, the kind of elder whose age seems to have reached a point of equilibrium beyond which time stops being counted, handed Alexander a carved oak staff saying, "For the navigator who is also a guardian, may this oak remind you that the deepest roots sustain the longest crossings." An elder woman with gray eyes that held depths impossible to fathom placed around Helena's neck an amber necklace with words that carried the weight of things said once and for all time. This amber comes from the beaches where Tiphys played as a child. Now it returns to you, her daughter, completing a journey that the amber made before any ship capable of making it yet existed. Makeda and Amina receive their gifts with the reverence of those who understand they are receiving not objects, but transmissions, continuity of memory, recognition of belonging, a living thread that connects past and future through the present instant. In the afternoon, Edith led them to the top of a hill that commanded the village and the surrounding lands with the specific perspective of high places that were chosen not by accident, but because they offer precisely the view necessary to understand what lies below. From there, they could see the verdant fields, the dense and serene woodlands, the streams winding between valleys with that innocence of waters that do not know the sea awaits them. And in the distance, wrapped in mist of a consistency that did not seem meteorological, the mountains, the same ones they had sighted from the sea, the ones that had called Helena by name in a language prior to words. "These are the sacred mountains," said Edith, pointing with the precision of one who knows not only the location, but the meaning. "Our ancestors believe, and when I say believe, I do not mean the way one has faith in something one cannot see, but the way one knows, because one has seen, that there resides the gateway between worlds, the portal that connects the land of the living to the land of the gods, the present to the past, the visible to the invisible." Helena fixed her gaze on the mountains with that gaze she had developed over the course of the journey, one that does not merely see, but listens. "We need to go there," she said, with the steadiness of statements that are not decisions, but recognitions of what had already been decided before it was put into words. Edith nodded with the serenity of one who already knew. "I know, and I will guide you when the time comes." The welcome ritual and the dance of the lineages. What was about to take place in the square of Amesbury was not a ceremony. It was something older and more precise than any ceremony. At dusk, with the sky passing from that deep blue into that specific violet that exists at no other hour of the day, the village gathered around the central fire with the synchronization of things that require no formal summons because the moment summons them. The stone circle was prepared with wildflowers, oak branches, and sacred mistletoe, not as decoration, but as activation, for within those elements resided an ancestral intelligence about what each of them called forth when placed in the presence of the others. The elders took their positions at the points of the circle with the precision of those who occupy their place within a geometry drawn by someone who understood things that most people had long ceased to understand. Skin drums and wooden flutes began to sound a melody that was not music in the decorative sense, but structure, a sonic framework that prepared the air, the space, and the people present for what was about to occur. Helena, Alexander, Makeda, and Amina were led to the center of the circle with that specific sensation of those who enter a space they can feel is different, not visually, but fundamentally. The moon was beginning to rise, and its silver light fell over the scene with the precision of something that had been calculated, not by human hands, but by forces that work on scales of time that render human planning irrelevant. Edith raised the silver chalice to the sky with both hands, not as a symbolic gesture, but as a real act of communication with something that was above and that was at the same time within each of those present. She invoked the ancient gods with words that Helena recognized in some place prior to memory, the language of Thule, preserved across generations with the specific faithfulness of languages that cease to be merely communication and become the custodianship of a way of seeing the world that cannot be expressed any other way. The words reach the group with that weight of true things that require no translation to be understood in their essence, because the essence of certain truths precedes the languages that express them. "O gods of sky and earth, of sea and wind," said Edith, and each word sounded like a stone laid upon a stone in the construction of something being raised in that very instant, yet which was, at the same time, the restoration of something that had existed before and had waited to be restored. The voice echoed across the square, and the drums responded with beats that made the ground vibrate at a frequency felt in the feet before it was perceived by the ears. The chalice of mead passed through the group with the solemnity of transmissions that are not merely symbolic, that transmit, in fact, something that exceeds the liquid contained within the metal. Helena drank first, and the mead descended with that specific warmth of substances we heat before receiving, because there is ancestral wisdom in the idea that certain things must be warmed before they can be taken in. Alexander drank next, feeling that passage of something that was not merely temperature, but intention, as though the liquid carried within it the memory of every moment it had been prepared, from the very first, long before any of those present had existed. Makeda and Amina completed the transmission, each with the specific awareness of those who understand they are participating in something that includes them, but is greater than any one of them individually. When the chalice returned to Edith and she poured the last drops onto the earth as an offering, not carelessly, but with the precision of one who returns to the soil what belongs to it, the drums intensified and the dance began. Helena was led to the inner circle, reserved, Edith explained without needing to explain, for the women of the lineage. With that quality of invitation that leaves no space for refusal, not through coercion, but because it arrives at the exact point where refusal would be a betrayal of one's own self. Edith took one of her hands. A distant cousin whom Helena had barely had time to know took the other. And then the movement began. Not dance in the performative sense, but dance in its original sense, prior to the stage and the spectator. Movement as prayer, as communication with forces that possess no form, but that respond to the rhythm with which bodies surrender to them. As she turned, as she leaped, as her bare feet touched the sacred earth with that frequency that exceeds the audible, Helena felt something happen that had neither been promised nor anticipated. All the women of her lineage dancing through her. Tiphys's mother, the grandmother, and all who had come before in a chain that extended to a point so distant in time that it lost the quality of history and assumed that of myth. Tears flowed, and they were the most honest possible expression of a joy that exceeds the human capacity to be contained in an upright posture. Alexander danced in the outer circle with the men, and for the first time in the entire journey he felt completely what it meant to be guardian as well as explorer. Because the dance they performed there was not a celebration of conquest, but an affirmation of belonging to the cycle of the earth, to the cycle of generations, to the cycle of promises that must be renewed in order to remain true. His feet on the ground revealed something that the sea, with all its vastness, had never been able to offer. A steadiness that is not limitation, but foundation. Makeda danced with the young women of the village with that joy that exists only in people who have learned to inhabit the present moment completely, without one eye on the past and the other on the future, but entirely there, entirely in that moment that would not come again. Amina moved with contemplative grace, her eyes closed, surrendering to the rhythm with the specific disposition of one who understands that certain forms of wisdom arrive only when we stop pursuing them and become vessel rather than hunter. The entire square was a single organism breathing, pulsing, celebrating, not an occasion, but the very continuity of life. When the dance ended, with that specific exhaustion of good exhaustion, the kind that emerges after something the body and soul have done together in complete accord. Those present lay upon the grass with laughter and quickened breathing, and the sky was so full of stars that it seemed a collective expression of approval. Edith approached Helena, embraced her with the tenderness of those who know that certain embraces are also blessings, and said, "Tonight, my niece, you are no longer merely the daughter of Tiphys. You are no longer merely a daughter of the sea. You are a daughter of Amesbury, a daughter of the earth, a daughter of lineages that extend to the beginning of time and that will extend beyond any horizon any of us is capable of imagining." Helena rested her head on Edith's shoulder, feeling herself, for the first time since she had set out in search of Thule, perhaps for the first time in her life, completely whole. The circle had closed. Not the circle of the journey, that still continued with everything that awaited beyond the mountains, but the circle of belonging, which had been broken since before her birth, and which had needed the entire crossing to be made whole again. The secrets of the mountains and the call beyond. The following morning brought something none of the previous nights had brought: clarity. The kind of clarity that only arrives after something internal has at last been resolved. Helena woke with that quality of wakefulness that distinguishes the awakening after truly restorative sleep, not the sleep that merely removes fatigue, but the kind that reorganizes. The sky over Amesbury was clear with the transparency of mornings that exist after deep weeping, after emotions that cleanse what had become opaque. Upon stepping out of Edith's house, she found Alexander already on his feet, but not with that restless vigil that sometimes came over him at sea when the horizon unsettled him by being too vast. This vigil was different. It was that of someone who had slept enough and who woke with a question that needed to be asked before the day began building arguments against it. "They are calling us," he said, without specifying, because specification was not necessary. "The mountains, always the mountains, since Douarnenez, since the horizon first sighted with that vision that belonged not only to the eyes." Helena placed her hand on his shoulder with the gesture of those who know that certain answers require no additional words. "Yes, and this time, we will not go alone." Edith appeared behind them as though the conversation had summoned her, carrying with her a map unfolded with the specific care given to objects that have been treated with reverence long enough for the reverence to become instinct. The map was made of goatskin, not for lack of technical means, but by the deliberate choice of a material built to last not decades, but centuries, to withstand not casual use, but the time that separates those who keep things from those who, generations later, need what was kept. It revealed hidden paths that wound between valleys and forests with the logic of trails not drawn by planning, but by the accumulation of footsteps of people who had found the way by the oldest method of all: attempt, attention, and return when wrong. At the center of the map, marked not with a cartographic symbol, but with the kind of detail that makes sense only to those who know what they are looking for, lay the chamber of the ancestors. "My grandparents," said Edith, with the voice of one transmitting not information, but custodianship, "used to say that within the chamber there are inscriptions that reveal the true path to Thule. But when they said true, they did not mean geographical, they meant essential." A pause. "Because Thule is not only a place, it is a state of consciousness, a portal between the visible and the invisible that every human being carries within, and that in most cases remains closed for an entire lifetime." Helena felt a shiver run the length of her spine with that specific quality of shivers that are not from cold, but from recognition, because everything that had happened since Concarneau, all the boreal lights, all the invisible voices, all the circles that revealed themselves where straight lines had been expected, suddenly articulated itself into a single understanding that had been waiting to be named. Edith proposed departing at the following dawn with the decisiveness of one who has already calculated what needs to be calculated and now merely communicates the result. "The journey to the mountains takes 3 days," she explained. "The path is steep with a steepness that is not only of the terrain, but of the disposition required of those who travel it. Only those whose hearts are aligned with sacred purposes, and here aligned does not mean perfect, but honest, can pass through the veils that protect the chamber." Alexander nodded with the specific gravity of one who understands the weight of something without, for that reason, retreating from it. Makeda, who had listened to the conversation with the attention of one who knows they are receiving information that will change something fundamental, stepped forward with a determination that was not stubbornness, but clarity of purpose. "I will go too. I came all this way guided by the desire to see the lights of Thule, to understand what my father could only describe and never show. If there is a chamber that holds these secrets, I must be there, not out of curiosity, but because something within me knows it is the place where I should be." Amina, always at the princess's side with that loyalty that is not servility, but choice. "Where she goes, I go. Our destinies are intertwined in a way that did not begin here and will not end here." Preparations began with that specific efficiency of groups that have already learned to work together under the pressure of long crossings. No wasted movement, no unnecessary hesitation, none of the rigidity of those who follow lists, and all the precision of those who have internalized what is essential. Edith gathered provisions with the knowledge of one who has been preparing journeys to sacred mountains long enough to know that what seems superfluous tends to be necessary, and what seems necessary tends to be less than one thinks. Medicinal herbs chosen with the precision of a language she had spent decades learning. Fresh water from a sacred spring, and here, sacred was not ornamental. There was a specific quality to that water, a lightness that exceeded chemical composition, and that those who drank it recognized in the body before understanding it in the mind. Oak staffs consecrated by the elders with words that carried, according to Edith, the accumulated intention of generations of guardians. Helena accepted hers with a reverence that no longer required effort. It had become natural over the course of a journey that had been, at its deepest essence, a training in precisely that kind of reverence. That afternoon, the elders of Amesbury gathered in the square with the specific gravity of rites performed because they must be performed, not because someone decided they would be, but because tradition demands them with the urgency of things that must be maintained for other things to continue to exist. They formed a circle around the 5 travelers, chanting songs of protection with voices that had been used for this purpose long enough for the use to have shaped not only the voice, but the capacity to transmit through it something that exceeds sound. The oldest elder, the one whose age seemed to have reached the point beyond which time ceases to mark any difference, approached Helena with the slowness of people who make every movement with the full awareness that it may be their last, and who, for that reason, perform each one with the completeness it deserves. He placed upon her forehead a mark made with sacred ash, ash from fires that had been kept alive across generations, carrying, according to Edith, the memory of everything that had been burned so that the light might continue. "May the eyes of the Spirit open," he said, in a voice that was at once specific and universal, personal and ancestral. "And may the hidden paths reveal themselves to those who seek with a heart honest enough to bear what they find." The same marks upon the other 4. And the silence that followed, that dense and fertile silence that is the result of words that landed exactly where they needed to land. That night, with the village at rest and the sky performing its silent exhibition of stars that needs no audience to take place, yet becomes different when there is someone who truly looks, Helena lay awake. She felt Edith's presence before she saw her, because there had developed between the two of them in those few days that quality of mutual perception that normally takes decades to develop between people, but that emerges instantly when two souls recognize in each other what they had been seeking without knowing they were seeking it. "Are you afraid?" asked Edith, sitting beside her with the ease of bodies that have aged enough to no longer spend energy on pretense. Helena considered the question with genuine seriousness, because it was the kind of question that deserved an honest answer rather than a reassuring one. "Not fear," she said at last. "Reverence. I feel that we are about to touch something that transcends human understanding, and reverence is the only honest response in the face of that." Edith smiled with the smile that Helena had learned to recognize as the smile of correct answers. "That is precisely the reverence that qualifies you. Those who arrive without it tend to return broken by what they find. Those who arrive with it return transformed by the same." The two of them sat in silence, side by side, watching the constellations that appeared not static, but in very slow motion, drawing, on a scale of time that exceeds any individual life, maps that no navigator had ever succeeded in copying completely, but that all had felt as guides. The horizon that opens and the oath of the new path. There was something different about the dawn of that departure, not in the light, in the quality of attention with which everyone received it. The sky opened over Amesbury in tones of gold and silver with that quality of dawns that seemed to have been composed specifically for the day they announce. Not that generic beauty the sun produces out of habit, but that other kind, intentional, that emerges on days when something that matters is about to begin. The village woke with a reverent silence that was different from the silence of rest. It was the silence of one who watches something and understands they have no adequate words to accompany it. The five travelers, Helena, Alexander, Makeda, Amina, and Edith, prepared themselves with the precision of those who set out knowing the path will demand every ounce of attention they can bring. In the central square, the inhabitants of Amesbury had formed a human corridor without anyone having suggested it, because certain arrangements emerge spontaneously when a community feels the weight of what is happening. Children scattered wildflower petals at the feet of the five with that specific generosity of children who have not yet learned to keep what is beautiful for themselves. It was farewell. It was blessing. It was the collective recognition that those who departed carried with them not only their own hopes, but those of everyone who remained and of everyone who, in previous generations, had waited for precisely that moment. Helena stopped at the threshold of the village, that specific point where the space of the community ends and the space of the world begins, and that in ancient communities was always marked in some way, sometimes visibly, sometimes only felt. She turned. She looked at Amesbury with that gaze that does not photograph, but receives, that does not try to capture, but to honor. Every house, every tree, every stone seemed to pulse with something she could only call mutual recognition, the land watching her depart with the same attention with which she had arrived. "It is not farewell," she murmured, more to herself than to any of the others, more to Amesbury than to any human being present. "It is until soon, for those who know that the paths circle back." Edith placed her hand on Helena's shoulder with that touch that had become, in a matter of days, the touch of someone known for an entire lifetime. Because sometimes blood creates a familiarity that time cannot produce more quickly than in a single encounter. The land never forgets those who honor it. And you, my niece, honored this land with every step you took upon it. When you return, it will receive you with everything it has kept during your absence, and it will have kept much. The words warmed Helena with that warmth that has no temperature yet is more real than any physical warmth, and she turned toward the mountains with the specific courage of one who no longer needs to pretend they feel no fear in order to go forward. The path began gently, winding between cultivated fields that spring had painted in greens so different from one another that they seemed deliberate. the palate of someone who understood that variety is a form of fullness that uniformity can never achieve. The surrounding oaks were ancient with that ancientness that confers upon trees not only height and girth, but a presence that younger ones have not yet developed, the presence of those who have survived long enough to have opinions about what endures. Helena walked alongside Edith, absorbing teachings about herbs, about birds, about stones, not in the academic manner of the transmission of information, but in the ancestral manner of the transmission of relationship. To learn that a particular herb heals not merely as botanical data, but as knowledge of something that cares for you when you care for it. Every step was also a lesson about what it means to belong to a place, not to possess it, not merely to inhabit it, but to relate to it with the specific reciprocity of relationships that last. As they advanced and the terrain began to slope with the gradual seriousness of ascents that do not pretend to be easy, the vegetation changed with that progressiveness nature uses when preparing a transition. The open and generous oaks giving way to pines that grew tall and close to one another, as though the altitude had taught the trees that solidarity is a survival strategy. The air became cooler and carried with it the specificity of places that most bodies never visit. That quality of altitude that is not merely temperature, but a different relationship with the world. Edith pointed to a rock formation rising in the distance with that quality of formations that have been chosen, not by the wind, but by something more deliberate, to mark a boundary that is not arbitrary. "The Gate of Winds," she said, in the voice used for names that are also instructions. "From here forward, we walk in silence with open hearts and serene minds, not as an imposed discipline, but as respect for something that watches and that permits only those to pass who arrive without any pretension to dominate what cannot be dominated." All nodded with the naturalness of those who understand that certain rules are not restrictions, but descriptions of the only way something can be done honestly. When they reached the Gate of Winds, a sudden icy breeze enveloped them with the precision of something acting with intention, not randomly, the way wind tends to act, but with that directed quality of forces that know where they are going. Edith raised the oak staff to the sky with both hands and pronounced ancient words with the voice of those who are not performing a ritual, but enacting one, a subtle and absolutely essential distinction. The wind intensified for a moment that seemed longer than the seconds it lasted, because within it was something that needed to be experienced before it could be assessed. An assessment was only possible after the full experience. And then it ceased. With the abruptness of decisions made by forces that have no need for gradual transitions to communicate that they have decided. "We have been accepted," said Edith, with a relief that was not the relief of one who had not been certain. It was the relief of one who had been certain, but who, out of respect for what was being tested, had waited for confirmation before celebrating. Helena felt gratitude pass through her entire body, not gratitude directed toward any person or specific entity she could name, but that diffuse and total gratitude that emerges when one realizes that the path being walked is, in fact, the path that should be walked. The sun was beginning to descend, that specific hour when the horizontal light possesses a quality that no other hour produces, the quality of things seen from the side, with a perspective that overhead light never permits. When they reached an elevated plateau from which the sacred mountains were visible in their fullness for the first time, the highest peak shone with perpetual snow that did not appear cold, it appeared luminous, as though the snow were storing light rather than merely reflecting it. Edith pointed to a narrow cleft between two cliff faces that was not visible from any angle but the exact one they stood upon. "There is the entrance to the chamber of the ancestors. We will arrive at nightfall tomorrow, if we walk with the right disposition." Alexander studied the steep path that still stretched before them and nodded with the specific determination of one who assesses difficulty without being dissuaded by it. Helena, at his side, took his hand. "We are ready," she said, not as a statement of technical preparation, but as a declaration of spiritual disposition. Ready for what comes, ready for what reveals itself, ready for what transforms. Makeda and Amina drew close, and the five formed a spontaneous circle because certain forms emerge naturally when the people who form them have already moved beyond the need to rehearse them. When the first star appeared, the one that always appears before the others, as though it carries the specific responsibility of announcing the night to the rest, Edith lit a small fire, and the group gathered around it with the ease developed over so many shared nights that the act had become its own language. Bread and warmed wine were shared in a silence that was not the absence of conversation, but the presence of something more essential than any conversation could be. Helena looked into the flames with eyes that had learned to see beyond the surface of fire, and saw, reflected within it with that clarity that only exists when we stop doubting what we see, the face of Tiphys, not as a ghost, not as a hallucination, as a presence. She smiled with the smile of one who sees something they waited a long time to see and who now sees it completely. Alexander, looking at Helena, felt the specific peace of one who is exactly where they should be, doing exactly what they should be doing, beside exactly who they should be beside. Makeda whispered a prayer to the gods of her homeland in the words she had learned before learning any other language, because there is a specific wisdom in first languages before the world teaches us to translate. Amina murmured protective incantations with the concentration of one who performs their work, knowing the work matters even when no one besides herself is aware it is being done. And Edith, guardian of all of it for decades, blessed the five with words spoken aloud, yet that seemed to come from somewhere far deeper than any human throat can reach. May the paths open, may the veils dissolve, may the truth reveal itself to those whose hearts remain honest before what they find, not what they expected to find, but what is truly there. The fire crackled in response, and the stars multiplied over the plateau with that profusion that happens on nights when the sky decides to show what it is capable of when there is someone sufficiently attentive to deserve the display. The group rested, and the rest on that night was itself a preparation, because what awaited beyond the cleft in the cliff faces, in the chamber where the ancestors kept what time had not managed to erase, would demand not only strength and courage, but that rarest and most necessary quality, the willingness to be completely transformed by what one is about to find, without attempting to control the form that transformation will take. In the next episode, guided by Edith through the hidden trails of the sacred mountains, Helena, Alexander, Makeda, and Amina will face not only the altitude and the cold that cuts like blades made of everything that has not yet been understood, but the veils between the visible and the invisible that guard the chamber of the ancestors, that place where the words that were never spoken in life continue to be pronounced forever, where the ancient inscriptions pulse with a light that belongs neither to torchfire nor to sun. There, in the depths where silence carries the texture of prayer, and where time functions in a way none of those present was trained to comprehend, Helena will discover that Thule was never a horizon to be reached. It was always an inner portal waiting to be awakened. And awakenings, like all true transformation, carry the highest price that exists, the previous version of oneself, which must be left behind with the same completeness with which Tiphys left Amesbury, fully without reservation, knowing that what remains is love, and what departs is destiny. Among visions that connect what was to what is yet to be, trials that test not strength, but the willingness to surrender to what cannot be controlled, and revelations that will lead every member of the group to question whether the longest crossing of a lifetime is the one that crosses seas, or the one that crosses the heart itself. A final oath will be sealed beneath the lights that dance above the summit, not of arrival, but of eternal return to the mystery that pulses within every human being who refuses to call impossible what has simply not yet come to pass.